Thank you for joining the Once Changing the World, which is India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Dr. Piers Millett, who's the co-founder at Biosecurity, Executive Director of the International Biosecurity and Biosafety Institute for Science, Senior Research Fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute, where he focuses on pandemic and deliberate disease and the implications of biotechnology. And Dr. Millett is a certified biorisk management professional with a specialization in biosecurity. Dr. Millett was also the deputy head of the implementation support unit for the Biological Weapons Convention. And today's topic of discussion is going to be the emerging risk from biotechnology, biowarfare, and bioterrorism, and how to safely advance biotech. So, Doctor, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. Why don't we start with a small introduction, background, and what got you interested in the area of biotech, biorisk, biosafety?
Sure. In fact, I guess the starting of my background is what got me interested in this. I trained originally as a microbiologist, and I was all set to go down the traditional route of joining a lab, and I was picking out specialisms in virology, the research that I wanted to do. When I saw a TV program actually that was about the history of biological warfare in the UK, and they said some things about the science behind it that I found interesting, and there I was, a newly minted microbiologist. Tried to get in touch with some of the experts they interviewed on that program. It turned out that we shared many interests, and I was at the University of Leeds at the time, and one of the professors there was at the University of Bradford. They were only about 50 miles apart. So I went across, met him. He said, "Hey, you should come and talk about these issues." And so I changed from doing straightforward science to science policy, and in particular those risks around the disease causing harm in humans. One of the things that got me interested was what is the chance of a plague coming and killing everybody on the planet, and the science behind that is kind of interesting. But even more interesting is the societal aspects, as we've seen with the recent pandemic. How we respond, what tools we have, has a huge impact on our ability to deal with these unusual diseases. And that led me naturally down the path that you described, right? Of trying to straddle the grounds between science and policy. And I guess that I've tried to build a career about translating between scientists and policymakers, and helping them share an understanding of what each is able to do and what they're not able to do, and where the opportunities are to maximize benefits and minimize risks.
Right. So emerging technology, specifically biotech, is growing exponentially. We have these tools such as CRISPR-Cas9 editing tool, which kind of allows you to tinker around with the source code of life, add a gene, take a DNA and things like that. You mentioned about the plague, that was a long time back, but then recently we had COVID-19, and the entire world got disrupted. With this acceleration of biotechnology and this tool coming into the hands of researchers all around the world, what are the chances of a deliberate design of a virus?
I should start off by saying that these tools provide lots of power, right? So we can use them to do amazing things for good. For example, the mRNA technologies that we've used against COVID will be incredibly important for future pandemics as well, I would imagine. And so happy to talk about how they may be misused, but we've also got to remember that we're gaining powerful new technologies and on how we could deal with those threats by using them in a positive way as well. So it's not just one side of the story. That having been said, I think there's a couple of things. Terrorism experts will tell you that people that want to do bad things use technologies they're familiar with. That's why we see more bombings and people driving cars or attacking people with knives. Those are technologies that people that do bad things are familiar with. So part of what is happening in the life sciences and biotechnology is we get more and more people in the field, as they become more useful, as we make more things with them, the chances of just having a bad actor who's familiar with those technologies deciding to cause harm, and that would be the technology they were most familiar with, grows as well. So I think that speaks a little bit to the likelihood piece. And then the other thing is that we're getting capabilities that we just never had before. There's some very famous quotes from folks like Tony Fauci from a decade or so ago saying nature is the world's worst bioterrorist, right? They're not going to ever be able to do worse than nature. Nature's had a million years or millions of years to evolve pathogens. And I think where we are with fields like synthetic biology, with the implications of AI and machine learning, we're getting to the point where we have capabilities beyond nature. We're able to access biological niches that have never been explored using, for example, xenodNA. So there's a sort of genetic material that's never naturally occurred. We're able to make improvements in photosynthesis. That's incredible. I've heard scientists argue that we were never going to do better than nature in developing synthetic pathways for photosynthesis, but we've seen some publications on that recently. So I believe that as we are beginning to open the doors to a real engineering discipline for biology, where we're able to make things quicker, faster, cheaper, and more reliably, we're beginning to have capabilities beyond nature. And I think that's where the risk comes, is that we're suddenly able to do things that as recently as sort of 10, 15 years ago seemed like science fiction.
So when you say that, our capabilities are growing beyond nature, and that's where the risk comes. I mean, could you elaborate on that? What are the immediate and risk of this, and maybe the far-term risk of this acceleration of understanding of biotech?
Sure. So I think some of these areas around how we might alter existing pathogens to make them worse, and we've seen that traditionally. If you trace it back, there's internationally recognized sort of 7 experiments of concern, things that you can do in biology that deserve a higher degree of oversight to make sure that they're not going to be misused, that they're not being done by people with malign intent. These are things like adding broad spectrum antibiotic resistance into a pathogen. If we have a bacterial infection that is we're struggling to contain naturally, people could add in multi-drug resistance and make it work deliberately. We're seeing the impact of when that happens naturally. There's also, amongst those 7 experiments, for example, altering the transmission. So specifically making something spread faster, or changing the host species, so making something jump from one species to another. We've traditionally, when that's happened in nature, can lead to really nasty disease outbreaks because the new host isn't used to it. Its immune system is naive, and we've got some examples of nasty disease jumps between species. So, and of course, then there's the sorts of work that was called the gain of function experiments with influenza back in 2011, where researchers were deliberately trying to make things more transmissible or more infective. There are strong scientific reasons why you might want to do that from time to time, but there are also many reasons why there could be risks associated with that. So, and I think that's one area. As we look forward, the implications of machine learning and AI in the short to medium term are in understanding relationships that have just been too complex for human researchers to understand. Most of those we can use to do absolutely amazing things. We can create new drugs, we can create new therapies, we can understand how disease is working at a completely different level. But the same sort of information would allow you to make alterations to pathogens or to toxins that either would make something new that maybe we haven't seen in nature before, and that may bypass some of the control measures that we already have in place, or it could be to make something worse in a way that circumvents some of those controls. So in the short term, I think it's about are the systems we put in place historically to deal with these risks going to be able to cope with the massive change in scale, the massive change in pace, and the jump to automated high throughput systems. That's going to be difficult.
Yeah, I want to talk about the how do we contain or mitigate these problems. But before we get into that, you are also the deputy head of the implementation support unit for the Biological Weapons Convention. Can you define?
I was right. No, yeah. I'm not now. I'm just
exactly. You were. You were. So can you define and differentiate between biowarfare and bioterrorism? And historically, if you could give context on the examples of biowarfare used by nations and bioterrorism incidents.
Sure. So at the basis is it depends whether there's a state or a non-state actor behind this. There have been examples of many of the powerful countries from the 20th century deliberately having very large-scale biological warfare programs where they want to producing or ready to produce large amounts of biological agents deliberately to cause disease as part of war fighting in an active conflict. So that, for example, there's a well-documented German program during the First World War where they were attacking mainly livestock on multiple continents to disrupt the ability of the opposing forces to field troops and manage logistics effectively. During the Second World War, huge preparations, in particular amongst Allied forces, to get ready to use biological weapons. They weren't used, but for example, the UK produced millions of linseed meal cattle cakes that had been laced with anthrax, the idea of distributing them over large parts of Germany out of long-range bombers so that cattle would get sick and die, and there would be a disease outbreak in Germany. Those were never used, but the preparations were made. And equally, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had an extensive program run both by its military and behind front industry companies in the civilian sphere that was on a scale equivalent to the Manhattan Project as far as getting ready to use that. So that's the warfare side. The terrorism side is really what happens if you have a non-state actor that isn't a state that wants to use it to cause harm. There's some classic examples of that. There's the Rajneeshi cult in the US that we found out after the fact had been poisoning salad bars to try and alter a local election. They were using infectious agents to do that. And then there are other examples. For example, the Shinrikyo cult in Japan, very famous for releasing the sarin gas on the Japanese subway. Prior to that, they tried to release anthrax spores across Tokyo to create an anthrax outbreak in the city.
It's surprising that we are the ones who can create magic, create life over here. Almost when we in the verge of like kind of tinkering around with the source code of life, and we'll be able to possibly maybe design new forms of life and create innovations and stuff like that. But at the same time, we've got the capability of, killing the entire race itself. It's funny how we do that, because this technology, we're standing at the cusp of like the most fantastic time in human history, where the convergence of technology will give us the power to, tinker around with things it was only meant for the gods to do. We're getting those kind of powers, and here we are. And it's. I hope that we find a way to create technology and innovation which takes the human race forward in a way which is more better. Now you are the executive director for the International Biosecurity and Biosafety Initiative for Science. Can you talk about that, and how does it contribute to reducing biological risk associated with these technological advances?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are important actors at the international level already. For example, we've mentioned the Biological Weapons Convention. There are others, the World Animal Health Organization, the World Health Organization, Interpol, all are in play already. And we have a relatively robust international network of organizations. But we believe there's some gaps, and that's what IBBIS is intended to fill. Three areas in particular. First of all, there's important work to be done at the operational level. There are new tools that we need, and crossing the threshold of just like there is in industry, there is the same sort of valley of death in policy making international organizations where we can have a good idea, we can develop it so far, but bridging the gap between having a good idea that works in theory or in the lab and then having one that's actually ready for use in the world, that's a big problem. And so IBBIS is intended to help bridge that gap. It's intended to de-risk some of these tools. We're happy to go and take new tools, try large-scale experiments with them, set up the system, try them out in the real world, and let states and international actors see how they work, what they cost, what the implications are, what sort of system needs to be built around them. And then if the intergovernmental processes are interested in them, happy to hand them over. So the first tool we will be trying this out with is gene synthesis screening technology. The idea being that there are companies around the world that make genes that sell them commercially. It's a good thing if those companies know who they're selling to and know what their orders are for. So we developed in partnership with various collaborators a tool to help identify the hazards from genetic sequences that allowed companies to do that screening. Now, there are tools already on the market. But they're quite expensive. Ours will be free. It'll be open source. It'll be available everywhere. It's built from the ground up with no ties to any government agencies or to intelligence agencies from around the world. So it's a good faith effort to put a technology out into the world that will help reduce risks, and allowing those sorts of organizations I mentioned to see how it could work, what it would require in reality, prove that when it goes onto somebody else's system that they're not sharing sensitive data or other, and they don't need to put any of their commercial or proprietary activities at risk. Really demonstrate that in practice. Let people see how it works, and hope that we can promote it around the world and get an uptake in use. Because at the moment, there's an estimate about 80% of companies are screening. I think that's probably a bit high. Our aim is to get that much closer to 100% within the next few years.
What are the DNA synthesis that worries you the most?
So I think. I don't think that an individual piece of synthesis is going to cause harm. I think there are some easy low-hanging fruit that we need to protect against, like toxins which are basically sort of natural poisons, can be produced from a very small set of genes. So it would be good news to know that a company is aware if it is fulfilling an order for genes that could be used to make toxins. So that is things like the anthrax toxin or the botulinum toxin that we've seen in cases. And famously, the aberrin toxin that appeared in the final few episodes of Breaking Bad a few years ago and led to much interest on the dark web about trying to get hold of that particular toxin. Again, comparatively few genes need to synthesize it if you know how to do that. So it's a good thing if companies that are selling genes are aware of if an order like that crosses their company.
Right. In the course of conversation, you mentioned about the gains of function research. What are the biorisks, both accidental as well as deliberate, that worries you?
As we start deploying some of these new technologies, new techniques to be able to understand the fundamental principles of disease, one of the things that worries lots of people most is where the next pandemic is coming from. And we have the ability now to both go out into the world and to look for pathogens we haven't spotted before, or that could be the next one that emerges and causes something new. And that carries a series of risks with it. If we actively go and try and find new viruses and we put them to labs, historically, even the most well-resourced, secure labs in the world still have accidents. We can see this with SARS, we can see this with smallpox, we can see this with many of the most infectious pathogens we have on the planet. Occasionally they accidentally escape. So there is risk just by collecting viruses that we accidentally release it somewhere. We're also at the point of being able to sort of trying to understand how one pathogen could get worse and maybe how it could jump into the space of causing a pandemic. And that's what that research back in 2011 was attempting to do. It was saying, well, we've got strains of influenza virus out there that are only a few mutations away from being even worse. Let's go and find out exactly what the mutations are so we can go out into the world and try and see how close the strains circulating in nature are to the one that we really need to be worried about. But that also then creates accidental risks. So all of a sudden we've got these really, really nasty, potentially pandemic pathogens in labs, but we're also generating the knowledge that could be misused by others, by people who have a malicious intent to create a pathogen that could cause a pandemic. And I think for me, there's three factors that we're thinking about there, which is, is it transmissible? How fast will it spread between people? How lethal is it? Is it going to kill or incapacitate large numbers of people? And then do we have public health measures that could control it? I think personally, I think any virus that is highly infectious, that is highly lethal, and that we don't have public health measures should deserve to be treated like a global scale risk and have global level oversight. And we do have examples of that. For example, smallpox has been eradicated. It is placed under a huge amount of international oversight before you can do any research with a live virus. It has to be approved by the World Health Organization. They have a special committee to do that, and the work is only carried out in 2 laboratories under international inspection anywhere in the world. So I think if we had something that was infectious lethal and we don't have protection against, that's the sort of level of oversight that is warranted, in my opinion. Not everybody believes the same.
So you mentioned that IBBIS has developed this tool for screening DNA synthesis. What are the other tools that you're working on, and how difficult or challenging it is to mitigate a problem like this?
So to answer the second part first, the tool that we will be producing, we like to think about this as raising the floor and raising the ceiling. At the moment, I said there's a gap. There are companies that aren't screening. It is far from universal. So the tool we're producing is designed to raise that floor to get to the point where everybody everywhere is doing a minimal amount of screening. That's comparatively straightforward. We're screening against pathogens that are already controlled. We're screening against gene sequences that are already well documented in the public domain to be connected with pathogenicity or infectivity. Where it gets more difficult is if you're talking about trying to protect against things we don't know now, or that not everybody knows now. And so one of the challenges is around information hazards. If a scientist or a government or a researcher somewhere suddenly identifies a new gene that could be really dangerous if misused, or that could cause lots of accidents, how that knowledge is shared, when that knowledge is shared, to whom that knowledge is shared, is a long-standing challenge in not only the life sciences, but certainly in the life sciences. And in this space, we also have that issue that if you're screening against a database of sequences of concern that could be misused, the existence of that database, if it contains sequences that aren't already well known, well documented, causes the risk somebody comes along and uses that database to cause harm. And the tools that we build then become things that could be misused by malicious actors. So then you enter into a world of how you handle those risks. There are other companies focused very much on building highly sophisticated encryption systems that will keep that information safe, so that you can build a system that allows the screening to take place, but that no humans themselves know what all of the sequences are that we're worried about. Fascinating alternative approach, and that one is raising the ceiling of how do we deal with future risks. So yeah, I think there's a space for both, and I think we need to be able to do both in the short to medium term.
Right. And what's the role of these international organizations such as World Health Organization, United Nations? Are they playing a role in mitigating this problem?
Well, exactly. They are. They're super important, especially at setting international norms, international principles. So that, for example, the Biological Weapons Convention was the first global ban on any type of weapon, and the idea being that no country anywhere should be developing these as a tool of war. They should be not supporting others to develop biological weapons. That's incredibly important. And then how you translate that into operational things, what happens in the lab, what happens inside countries. There are other instruments. The UN Security Council has a resolution 1540 that prohibits across the globe individuals, organizations from developing chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. So it's against that resolution anywhere for a non-state actor to do this. And then, as I said, there's this question of how you translate that into the lab, what happens with research and practice. And that's where things like the World Health Organization program is so important. They've recently, at the start of this year, released a governance framework for responsible life science research that is meant to help set the framework that will help maximize benefits and minimize risks. And so building that international norm, that international standard of what's meant to happen is vitally important. And then where the work is to do is to translate those principles and frameworks into effective action on the ground. And that's much more difficult because the level of resources that has been invested in dealing with these risks is very small. When I was working for the Implementation Support Unit, which was the only intergovernmental team focused on these risks, their budget is roughly the same as a small McDonald's, not a chain, an individual McDonald's. That's roughly what their turnover was. That's what the international community was spending on the dealing with the international threat of biological warfare, which to me is crazy. I think it's an issue that we should be taking much more seriously and investing much more heavily on.
Yeah. I don't know why they wait for problems to happen. I mean, these field needs, investment so that we secure a future rather than ending up in a situation like how we ended up with COVID. Are there any rogue nations, bad actors that you can speak about at this point in time, which is not complying to globally?
I think the best place to point you to this is, yes, there absolutely are, and more credible than me telling you who I think they are. If you go away and look, like the US State Department has a declassified report on compliance with weapons of mass destruction treaties. They mention states in the world that they think either have a biological weapons program or have a breakout capability. And what they mean there is that countries have pre-positioned all of the necessary capabilities. They may not actively be making biological weapons at the moment, but if they ever chose to, they could do that quite quickly. And I'm sure if you went to other parts of the world, that they will also have accusations and concerns against many other countries. You know, it's not just the US list. There is certainly, if you look at the government official communications, both sides, the war in Ukraine, for example, have accused the other of developing biological weapons at one time or another. So there's that piece, and certainly Interpol from time to time will talk about the threat of non-state actors. They believe and state on a regular basis. There are groups around the world that see these as attractive weapons and are trying to get chemical and biological weapons to cause harm. So I think it is those in the know that really have access to the intelligence data seem to think this is a real threat. And I don't have access to that information. So whatever I would say is only based upon half of the picture.
You've been invested in the space for the longest time. How do you see the future and unfolding, with this convergence of technology, people having access, there is AI, there is biotech, and so how is this going to play out in the next 10 years if we do not do the right things?
So I'm fundamentally an optimist. So I think these are powerful technologies that will help us deal with a lot of these risks. I can see some real concerns there that I think, as I said earlier, the greatest thing that concerns me is maybe a lack of awareness amongst the policy world that things that used to take a decade will now take months. Things that we thought were impossible and so far in the future that we shouldn't need to worry about them now happen on a seemingly regular basis. A solid example of that is effectively moving very close to predictive protein design. 5 years ago, that seemed over the horizon. Thanks to machine learning, that is now a thing that is here, and it's very exciting for a wide range of applications, but also has the potential to be misused. And I'm not sure many policymakers around the world are fully aware of what is happening, what is about to happen in that space.
Dr. Piers, really, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. I mean, we spoke about the risk a lot, during the course of conversation. I think it'll be really nice if you could leave us with biotechnology and how it's going to change the world if you use it for good.
Absolutely. So, and this really also nicely picks up something I should have mentioned before that I think may be of interest, and I think from a global level is vitally important, that we see countries around the world really investing in biotechnology. If you look at national bioeconomy strategies, there are countries that are putting the money where their mouth is, and they're investing heavily at positioning themselves at the forefront of this next industrial revolution. And it potentially can change where the power players are. If we want to make things with biology, those countries with large excesses of biomass, I think in countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, suddenly become vital resources. They have access to resources that others may struggle to get. I think as we move forward, this idea of the zero-sum game is the one that will change. The idea that we have to stop making food if we want to make fuel using biotechnology could change. It certainly will be vitally important as part of a circular bioeconomy. We have the potential to go beyond a circular bioeconomy. The idea here of not wasting anything that we finished doing with, we could use biology to repurpose, reuse, and that's including climate issues around carbon capture and reducing our carbon output. So I think these are all things that biotechnology could play a huge role in, and I'm really hoping that we see that. So I think embedding some of these responsibility issues, making sure that we are thinking about the risks when we're investing and solving those global level challenges. I think we're going to be able to do that, but I think it's something we have to start thinking about now before we start using some of these very powerful technologies outside containment in the next decade or so.
Thank you, Doctor. Really, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. You painted a picture of what the world would look like if we do the wrong things and what the world could look like if we do the right things. I hope the listeners, the governments, and people in power take the right choice. Yeah. So on that note, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye. Thank you. Really appreciate this.